The Great Miao Rebellion of the 17th century, a tale of bravery and defiance in the misty mountains of southwestern China, a centuries-old struggle between the Han Chinese Empire and the Miao people, was about to reach its boiling point. The year was 1655, and the winds of change were whispering through the valleys, carrying with them the whispers of discontent among the Miao tribes. For generations, the Miao had lived in these mountains, maintaining a tenuous relationship with the Han Chinese Empire. They traded goods, shared cultural practices, and even intermarried to some extent. However, beneath this veneer of cooperation lay a deep-seated resentment toward the Han's oppressive rule and exploitation of their lands. As the years went by, the Miao people grew weary of being forced to conform to Han customs and traditions. They chafed against the yoke of Chinese control, feeling that their unique culture and way of life were under threat. In the early 17th century, a charismatic leader emerged among the Miao, Wang Fangping, a fiery and determined individual who would spark the flames of rebellion. Wang Fangping was no stranger to the struggles faced by his people. Born into a family of modest means, he had witnessed firsthand the Han's heavy-handed tactics and the suffering they inflicted upon the Miao. His own father had been killed in a brutal clash with Chinese soldiers, leaving Wang's mother to raise him and his siblings on her own. As Wang grew older, his desire for revenge and his passion for justice only intensified. He became convinced that the time had come to stand up against their oppressors and fight for the rights of his people. Gathering a small group of trusted allies, he began secretly meeting with other Miao leaders, sharing his vision of a free and independent homeland. The Han authorities, however, were not oblivious to these stirrings of dissent. They had long regarded the Miao as a troublesome minority prone to rebellion and disorder. In 1655, as tensions mounted, the Chinese governor of the region, Zhang Tingyu, dispatched a contingent of soldiers to quell any potential uprising. But Wang Fangping was no ordinary rebel leader. He possessed a deep understanding of his people's culture and history, which he leveraged to rally the Miao behind his banner. He preached a message of unity and resistance against the Han's tyranny, emphasizing the need for self-determination and the right to govern themselves. As the Chinese soldiers descended upon the mountains, Wang Fangping led his followers in a series of guerrilla attacks, targeting Han patrols and supply lines. The Miao warriors proved surprisingly effective, exploiting their intimate knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver and outfight their oppressors. The rebellion spread rapidly across the region, drawing in Miao from all walks of life. Women played a crucial role, using their cunning and resourcefulness to disrupt Han communications and supply lines. Elderly Miao men, with their deep understanding of traditional practices and rituals, served as spiritual leaders, guiding their communities through the trials ahead. The Han authorities responded with brutal force, unleashing waves of terror upon the Miao population. They razed villages, slaughtered livestock, and imprisoned suspected rebels. Wang Fangping himself narrowly escaped capture on multiple occasions, but his legend only grew among his people. As the conflict dragged on for years, the Great Miao Rebellion became a defining moment in Chinese history. The Han Empire was forced to confront the depth of Miao discontent and the resilience of their rebellion. In 1662, after a grueling 7-year struggle, Wang Fangping's forces achieved a significant victory at the Battle of Tujia, driving the Han out of key Miao territories. The Great Miao Rebellion had left an indelible mark on China's collective memory. The struggle for independence and self-determination had been waged, and though it would take centuries to fully resolve the issues, Wang Fangping's courage and conviction had inspired a new generation of Miao leaders to continue the fight. In the mountains of southwestern China, where the misty peaks meet the sky, the legacy of Wang Fangping and the Great Miao Rebellion still echoes through the valleys. It is a testament to the enduring spirit of a people who refused to be silenced by oppression, and whose bravery continues to inspire generations to this day. The sun had long since set on the mist-shrouded mountains, casting a golden glow over the lush valleys and dense forests that crisscrossed the southern provinces of China. It was an era of tumultuous change, as the once mighty Ming dynasty teetered on the brink of collapse, its imperial court beset by internal strife, corruption, and foreign invasion. Deep within this troubled landscape, a simmering cauldron of discontent had been brewing for decades. The Miao people, a proud and ancient ethnic minority with their own distinct culture, language, and traditions, had long suffered under the yoke of Chinese rule. Their lands were coveted by the imperial government, which sought to exploit the region's natural resources and incorporate it into its vast empire. As the years passed, tensions between the Miao and the Chinese authorities continued to escalate. The Miao, who lived in a network of isolated mountain valleys, had long been forced to pay exorbitant tributes to their Han Chinese overlords, while being denied access to basic rights and freedoms. This state of affairs had created a powder keg of resentment which was waiting to be ignited. That ignition came in the form of a charismatic young Miao leader named Wang Fangping. A natural-born orator with a fiery passion for his people's cause, Wang had spent years studying the teachings of the great Chinese philosophers, as well as the tactics of successful rebellions throughout history. He was convinced that the time had come to take a stand against their oppressors and fight for their rights. As Wang began to secretly rally support among the Miao people, whispers of revolution spread like wildfire through the mountains. News of his message, one of freedom, equality, and national self-determination, drew thousands of Miao warriors to his banner, each eager to take up arms against their tormentors. The spark that set off this powder keg was a brutal incident in which a group of Miao villagers were brutally slaughtered by Chinese soldiers who had been sent to collect the region's tributes. The atrocity was committed in cold blood, with the victims' bodies left to rot in the open fields for all to see. Enraged and heartbroken, Wang Fangping knew that the time had come to strike back against their oppressors. With a small band of trusted lieutenants, he launched a surprise attack on a Chinese army outpost deep in Miao territory. The resulting battle was fierce and bloody, with the Miao warriors fighting valiantly, but ultimately being pushed back by superior numbers. Though they suffered defeat, Wang Fangping's boldness had galvanized the Miao people into action. News of their rebellion spread like wildfire throughout the region, drawing more and more Miao warriors to join the fight against their oppressors. The Great Miao Rebellion had begun in earnest, with Wang Fangping at its helm. As the fighting raged on, the Chinese government responded with brutal force, dispatching thousands of soldiers to quell the uprising. But the Miao people were no pushover, and they put up a fierce resistance against their attackers. The war was marked by numerous skirmishes, ambushes, and battles, each side suffering heavy casualties. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Wang Fangping's forces managed to inflict significant damage on their enemies, with many Chinese soldiers falling in battle or defecting to the Miao cause. As the months passed, the rebellion gained momentum, with more and more Miao villages rising up against their oppressors. The Great Miao Rebellion would eventually be put down by the Chinese authorities, but not before it had left a lasting impact on the region's history. Wang Fangping, the charismatic leader who had ignited the spark of revolution, was ultimately captured and executed for his crimes against the state. But his legacy lived on, inspiring future generations of Miao people to fight for their rights and freedoms. The memory of this rebellion would continue to simmer beneath the surface, waiting for the next spark that would set it ablaze once more. In the misty mountains of southwestern China, a world apart from the bustling cities and imperial courts of the Ming Dynasty, the Miao people had lived for centuries in harmony with the land and their own unique traditions. Theirs was a culture born of the rugged landscape, shaped by the rhythms of nature and the secrets whispered by the ancient trees. For generations, the Miao had built their homes amidst the towering peaks and verdant valleys, their villages nestled like gemstones within the folds of the mountains. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wild flowers, and the sound of rushing streams provided a constant lullaby. It was here that the Miao developed their own distinct way of life, one that blended seamlessly with the land and its creatures. The Miao were master craftsmen, skilled in the art of weaving, dyeing, and embroidery. Their clothing was a kaleidoscope of colors, with intricate patterns and designs that told stories of their history, myths, and legends. The women's garments, in particular, were renowned for their beauty and complexity, featuring delicate threads of silk and cotton, woven together with precision and care. The Miao people were also expert farmers, coaxing crops from the fertile soil and tending to their animals with a deep understanding of the natural world. They cultivated rice, maize, and other staple crops, as well as medicinal plants and herbs that played a crucial role in their traditional healing practices. The mountainsides were dotted with small plots of land, worked tirelessly by the Miao farmers who knew every inch of the terrain and every secret it held. Despite their isolation, the Miao were not strangers to outsiders. Merchants and travelers had long passed through their territories, carrying exotic goods and stories from distant lands. The Miao had developed a robust trade network with neighboring tribes and communities, exchanging goods such as silver, copper, and precious stones for valuable commodities like silk, tea, and porcelain. Yet despite these connections to the wider world, the Miao remained fiercely proud of their independence and cultural identity. They were a people deeply rooted in tradition, with a rich spiritual heritage that emphasized harmony with nature and respect for the ancestors. Their rituals and ceremonies, often performed under the light of full moons or amidst the misty veil of dawn, were an integral part of their daily lives. As the 17th century unfolded, however, the Miao world began to change. The Ming dynasty was weakening, its power waning as internal conflicts and external threats took their toll. In the mountains, the Miao people sensed the tremors of this instability, feeling the reverberations in their own lives. As the imperial court's grip on the region loosened, the Miao saw an opportunity to assert their autonomy, to reclaim their cultural heritage and protect their way of life. And so, amidst the whispers of the ancient trees and the rustling of leaves, the Great Miao Rebellion was born, a movement that would shake the foundations of the Ming dynasty and reshape the course of Chinese history. But for now, in this moment of quiet contemplation, the Miao people stood tall, their spirits rooted deep within the mountains, their hearts beating strong with the pulse of the land. As the sun rose over the misty mountains of southwestern China, a sense of unease settled over the Miao people. For centuries, they had lived in relative harmony with the Ming dynasty, their cultures intertwining like the threads of a rich tapestry. However, by the early 17th century, the very fabric of their existence was beginning to fray. To the north, the Manchu people were stirring, their nomadic tribesmen gathering strength and momentum, as they eyed the rich agricultural lands and strategic trade routes of southern China. The Ming dynasty, weakened by internal conflicts and corruption, struggled to maintain its tenuous grip on power. Court officials squabbled over positions and favors, while eunuchs manipulated the imperial succession, creating a climate of uncertainty that emboldened would-be challengers. In this precarious atmosphere, the Miao people sensed an opportunity to resist Chinese rule, which had long been oppressive and exploitative. For centuries, they had been forced to pay heavy taxes, provide labor for public works projects, and submit to the whims of local officials, who often treated them with disdain and contempt. The Miao, a proud and resilient people with their own distinct culture, language, and traditions, had long chafed under this yoke. As tensions mounted, whispers began to circulate among the Miao villages about rising up against their oppressors. In remote valleys and mist-shrouded hills, secret meetings took place beneath the cover of darkness, where elders and warriors discussed the feasibility of armed resistance. The air was thick with anticipation as they contemplated the possibility of breaking free from the shackles of Chinese domination. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the Ming court remained oblivious to the growing unrest among its Miao subjects. Preoccupied with internal power struggles and external threats from the Manchu, the imperial government failed to recognize the simmering discontent that would soon boil over into open rebellion. In the mountains, however, a new generation of Miao leaders was emerging, men and women who had grown tired of the humiliation and exploitation inflicted upon their people. They were a diverse group, ranging from seasoned warriors to young idealists, united by their determination to throw off the yoke of Chinese rule and forge their own path. As the seasons passed, the Miao began to mobilize, gathering arms, supplies, and allies in preparation for the struggle ahead. In hidden valleys and secluded strongholds, they honed their combat skills, perfected their tactics, and steeled themselves for the challenges that lay ahead. The very hillsides seemed to reverberate with their collective resolve. We will not be silenced, we will not be oppressed. And so, as the Great Miao Rebellion began to take shape, the stage was set for a protracted and bloody conflict that would shake the foundations of Chinese rule in southwestern China. The outcome was far from certain, but one thing was clear. The Miao people would no longer be pushed around by their oppressors, and their struggle for independence and self-determination would leave an indelible mark on the history of China. The sun was setting over the misty mountains, casting a golden glow over the lush valleys and verdant hillsides of Miao country. It was 1648, and the air was thick with tension as Wang Fangping, a charismatic leader with a fiery spirit, rallied his people for war. For generations, the Miao had lived in harmony with the land, their culture deeply rooted in the rhythms of nature. But as the Chinese Empire expanded its reach, encroaching on Miao lands and disrupting their way of life, tensions began to simmer. The Miao, a proud and fiercely independent people, would not be silenced. Wang Fangping, a skilled warrior and natural leader, had emerged as the voice of resistance. His message was simple: freedom from Chinese oppression, self-determination, and the right to govern their own affairs. As he traveled from village to village, his impassioned speeches and unwavering conviction inspired a generation of Miao warriors. The Chinese, however, were not about to relinquish their grip on this strategic region. Governor-General Jiang Tingzuo, determined to maintain control, had long considered the Miao a barbarous people, worthy only of subjugation. His soldiers, armed with swords and muskets, patrolled the borders, ever vigilant for signs of rebellion. On a crisp spring morning, Wang Fangping gave the signal. The Miao rebels, numbering in the thousands, launched a series of coordinated attacks against Chinese forces. Towns and villages along the trade routes were targeted, their defenses breached with relative ease. The Miao warriors, skilled in guerrilla warfare, exploited the terrain to devastating effect. As the rebellion gained momentum, Wang Fangping led his people in daring raids on key strongholds. The Chinese garrisons, caught off guard by the ferocity of the attacks, were quickly overwhelmed. Trade routes were disrupted and commerce ground to a halt as merchants and travelers fled the chaos. The rebels' tactics were brutal yet effective. They targeted supply lines, cutting off the Chinese army's lifeline. Wang Fangping's forces also launched surprise attacks on isolated outposts, decimating entire garrisons. The Miao warriors, driven by a mix of patriotism and desperation, fought with a ferocity that left even their enemies in awe. The Chinese response was brutal, with Governor-General Jiang ordering the deployment of additional troops to quell the uprising, but Wang Fangping's rebels were not easily deterred. They adapted their tactics, using clever ambushes and hit-and-run attacks to whittle down the enemy's strength. As the conflict raged on, the Miao people began to see Wang Fangping as a hero, a champion of their freedom and way of life. His legend grew with each passing day, his name whispered in reverence around campfires and village squares. The Chinese, however, viewed him as a rebel leader, a troublemaker who must be crushed at all costs. The Great Miao Rebellion had begun, a conflict that would rage on for years to come, leaving scars that would take generations to heal. In the midst of chaos and destruction, Wang Fangping stood tall, his vision of freedom and self-determination burning brighter than ever before. The sun was setting over the misty mountains, casting a golden glow over the lush green valleys and dense forests that had been home to the Miao people for generations. It was a time of great change, as the Han Chinese Empire continued its relentless expansion into the farthest reaches of the country. The Miao, a proud and independent people with their own distinct language, customs, and way of life, felt the weight of this encroachment bearing down upon them. As the years passed, more and more Han settlers and merchants began to arrive in Miao territory, seeking to exploit its natural resources and capitalize on its strategic location. They brought with them new ideas, customs, and technologies that threatened to disrupt the traditional way of life in these mountains. The Miao people, who had long lived in harmony with nature and maintained a strong connection to their ancestral lands, began to feel like they were losing control over their own destiny. One of the earliest signs of discontent was the growing resentment among the Miao towards the Han merchants who came to trade in their markets. These merchants would often arrive with lavish gifts and promises of prosperity, only to drive hard bargains that left the Miao people feeling exploited and disrespected. The Miao began to see these outsiders as threats to their way of life, and tensions simmered just below the surface. As the Han presence grew, so too did the resentment among the Miao. They watched as their sacred forests were cleared for timber and farmland, and their ancient rituals and ceremonies were mocked or ignored by the newcomers. The Miao people felt like they were being forced to abandon their traditions and adopt the ways of the outsiders, which only served to deepen their sense of unease. It was against this backdrop of encroachment and exploitation that the Great Miao Rebellion began to take shape. A charismatic leader emerged from among the Miao people, a man named Wang Fangping, who possessed a deep understanding of his people's history and culture. Wang saw the writing on the wall. The Han were not going away, and it was only a matter of time before they sought to assimilate the Miao into their own fold. Wang knew that something had to be done to protect the Miao way of life, and so he began to rally his people against the encroaching Han. He traveled from village to village, stirring up sentiment among the Miao people and calling upon them to stand united against this threat to their very existence. The response was overwhelming. Men and women from all walks of life joined Wang's cause, determined to defend their lands, customs, and way of life. As the rebellion gained momentum, the Han authorities responded with brutal force. They saw the Miao people as savages and barbarians, and they believed that the only way to bring them under control was through violence and intimidation. The Miao, however, were not afraid. They had lived in these mountains for generations, and they knew every inch of their land. They fought back with guerrilla warfare, using the terrain to their advantage as they launched surprise attacks on Han patrols and settlements. The rebellion raged on for years, with both sides suffering heavy losses. But despite the odds against them, the Miao people refused to give up. They were fighting for their very survival, and they would not be silenced or intimidated by the Han authorities. In the end, it was the Han who were forced to withdraw from Miao territory, defeated by the sheer determination and resilience of the Miao people. The Great Miao Rebellion may have ended in defeat for the Han, but its legacy lived on a testament to the power of resistance and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. For the Miao people, it was a symbol of their enduring spirit and their refusal to surrender to external forces that sought to erase their very identity. As the Great Miao Rebellion gained momentum, it was as if a tidal wave of defiance had swept across the mountains and valleys of southwestern China. The once peaceful Miao communities, long suffering under the yoke of Chinese colonial rule, had finally reached their breaking point. In the early years of the rebellion, small groups of Miao warriors had begun to mobilize, armed with nothing more than their traditional bows, arrows, and spears. But as news of their resistance spread, more and more villages joined the fight. The air was filled with the sound of drums and cymbals as Miao leaders rallied their people, calling upon ancient traditions of guerrilla warfare to launch a full-scale assault on the Chinese occupation forces. As the rebellion grew in strength, entire towns were abandoned by the Chinese authorities, leaving only skeletal garrisons to face the Miao onslaught. The once orderly streets of Quanzhong and Wuding counties were now scenes of chaos and carnage, with Miao warriors burning villages, destroying bridges, and slaughtering any Chinese soldiers who dared to stand in their way. The sheer scale of the rebellion was breathtaking. Estimates suggest that up to 100,000 rebels were involved at its peak, a staggering figure considering the Miao population had been decimated by decades of war, famine, and disease. Yet, despite these odds, the Miao fighters continued to pour in from all directions, their faces set with determination as they marched towards the heart of Chinese power. One by one, strategic strongholds fell to the rebels. The ancient city of Qiandongnan, once a symbol of Chinese dominance, was captured and pillaged, its walls breached by the sheer force of Miao fury. The rebel forces then turned their attention to the nearby town of Yangshi, where they unleashed a devastating campaign of sabotage and terrorism that left the town in ruins. As the rebellion raged on, the Chinese authorities were forced to confront the reality of their own vulnerability. Panic spread through the imperial court as reports of Miao atrocities flooded in, telling tales of brutal massacres, burned-out towns, and even the desecration of sacred Buddhist temples. The once mighty Qing dynasty was now reeling from a crisis that threatened to consume it whole. In the midst of this chaos, a new generation of Miao leaders emerged, men and women who had grown up under the shadow of colonial rule, but were determined to forge a brighter future for their people. These rebels were not just fighting for independence, they were fighting for the very survival of their culture and way of life. As the Great Miao Rebellion continued to gather momentum, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The mountains and valleys of southwestern China would never be the same. The very fabric of Chinese society had been torn asunder by the sheer force of Miao defiance. And in the midst of this turmoil, a new nation was being forged, one that would forever change the course of history. As the flames of rebellion began to engulf the Miao villages, the Qing dynasty, still basking in the glory of their recent conquest of China, grew restless. The emperor himself, Kangxi, was not one to tolerate any form of insubordination, and he knew that the Miao uprising would need to be dealt with swiftly and decisively. In the imperial palace in Beijing, a series of orders were dispatched to the farthest reaches of the empire, calling forth mighty armies to quell the rebellion. The Qing military machine was renowned for its discipline and organization, and it would not be long before the mightiest warlords and generals received their marching orders. As the sun rose over the dusty plains and mountain passes of southern China, columns of soldiers began to converge on the Miao territories. Led by seasoned veterans of countless battles, these armies were a force to be reckoned with, steel-tipped pikes and gleaming swords glinting in the morning light as they marched forth. Among them was General Zhang, a battle-hardened warrior with a reputation for ruthlessness. His army, comprising some 5,000 men, had been dispatched from the province of Sichuan, where the Qing dynasty's grip on power was strongest. As he rode at the forefront of his troops, General Zhang gazed out upon the rolling hills and verdant valleys through which they would soon pass. To the north, another force was assembling under the command of General Wang, a seasoned strategist with a keen eye for terrain and tactics. His army, comprising some 4,000 men, had been drawn from the provinces of Yunnan and Guizhou, where the Qing dynasty's influence was more tenuous. As he surveyed his troops, General Wang could not help but feel a sense of unease. The Miao rebels were notorious for their cunning and ferocity in battle. Meanwhile, in the heart of the rebellion itself, the Miao leaders were facing a crisis of their own. With the Qing armies closing in from all sides, they knew that their very survival was at stake. The once proud Miao warriors, now scattered across the countryside, were forced to abandon their traditional tactics and adapt to the changing circumstances. In the midst of this chaos, the Miao leader, Wang Fangping, a fiery and charismatic figure, rallied his people with impassioned speeches and defiant cries. His words echoed through the valleys and hills, inspiring his followers to stand firm against the encroaching Qing forces. As the armies clashed in a series of brutal battles, the landscape itself seemed to transform. Once peaceful villages were reduced to smoldering ruins, and the very fabric of Miao society was torn asunder. The air grew thick with smoke and ash, and the scent of blood and sweat hung heavy over the war-torn territories. In the midst of this maelstrom, General Zhang's army emerged victorious in a series of decisive battles, pushing deep into the heart of Miao territory. General Wang's forces, however, faced stiffer resistance, bogged down by the treacherous terrain and cunning tactics employed by their Miao foes. Despite these setbacks, the Qing dynasty remained resolute in its determination to quell the rebellion once and for all. As the armies continued to clash, the outcome of the conflict hung precariously in the balance. Would the Miao people be able to withstand the crushing might of the Qing dynasty, or would they succumb to the relentless pressure? Only time would tell it. The Qing forces, determined to crush the Miao rebellion once and for all, unleashed a wave of brutal tactics that would leave a lasting scar on the land and its people. As the armies of Manchu and Han converged upon the rebellious Miao territories, a sense of dread settled over the mountains and valleys. In the early days of the campaign, the Qing forces employed a strategy of divide and conquer, sowing discord among the various Miao tribes by offering favorable treatment to those who submitted quickly. But as the rebellion continued to spread, the Qing generals turned to more draconian measures. One of the most devastating tactics was the wholesale destruction of Miao villages. Armies of soldiers, armed with torches and axes, descended upon unsuspecting towns and hamlets, leaving nothing but ashes and rubble in their wake. The once thriving communities were reduced to smoldering ruins, their inhabitants either fled or slaughtered. The people of the Miao tribes, already weakened by years of war and poverty, were caught off guard by this sudden onslaught. Women and children, huddled together in fear, watched as their homes were reduced to dust and debris. The sound of screams and wails filled the air as families were torn apart, their members scattered or killed. In the aftermath of these brutal attacks, the Qing forces would often conduct cleansing operations, rounding up any remaining Miao survivors and forcing them to relocate deep within Manchu territory. These prisoners were subjected to forced labor, forced conversions to Buddhism or Taoism, and brutal physical punishment for any perceived disobedience. As the armies marched through the mountains, they left a trail of devastation in their wake. The once lush forests were scorched and charred. The rivers ran red with blood, and the very earth seemed to scream in agony. Miao people, already traumatized by the destruction of their homes and way of life, were forced to confront the harsh reality that their rebellion was all but crushed. In the midst of this chaos, individual stories of survival and resilience emerged. A young Miao girl, hiding in a hidden valley with her family, watched as the Qing forces razed her village to the ground. She saw her parents taken away, never to be seen again, and she herself was forced into servitude. Despite the odds, this courageous young woman managed to survive, using her wits and cunning to evade capture and eventually escape into the wilderness. There, she joined a small band of Miao guerrilla fighters who vowed to continue the struggle against their oppressors. As the years passed, the Qing forces continued to employ brutal tactics to quell the rebellion, but they never fully succeeded in breaking the Miao people's spirit. The great Miao rebellion may have been crushed, but its legacy lived on, inspiring future generations of Miao warriors to take up arms against their oppressors and fight for their freedom and way of life. As the sun dipped below the misty mountains, the Miao rebels knew their time was running out. Despite their valiant efforts to drive back the Han Chinese forces, they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The once strong armies of the rebellion had been whittled down by months of brutal battles, leaving only scattered remnants of their former selves. In the midst of this desperation, leaders like Wang Fang and Luo Xian emerged as beacons of hope. These fearless warriors rallied their comrades, urging them to make a final stand against their oppressors. With swords flashing in the fading light, they launched a series of daring assaults on Han Chinese strongholds, hoping to catch their enemies off guard. One such assault took place at dawn on the outskirts of a small town called Shangji. A ragtag band of rebels, led by Wang Fang himself, crept through the mist-shrouded valleys, avoiding the enemy patrols with precision. Their target was a fortified outpost, home to a contingent of Han Chinese soldiers and militiamen. As they approached, the Miao rebels could see the dark silhouettes of the enemy's watchtowers looming above the rooftops. Wang Fang signaled his men forward, and they charged into battle with a fierce war cry. The sounds of clashing steel and shattering wooden walls filled the air as the two sides clashed in a frenzy of violence. But despite their bravery, the Miao rebels were no match for the Han Chinese army's superior numbers and firepower. One by one, Wang Fang's men fell to the ground, their bodies torn apart by hailstorms of arrows and cannonballs. The leader himself was struck down, his lifeless body left lying in a pool of blood. With their commanders fallen, the remaining rebels were forced to retreat into the mountains, pursued by Han Chinese troops who showed no mercy. Thousands of Miao warriors fled into remote areas, seeking refuge in caves, forests, and hidden valleys. Many more were captured and taken prisoner, their lives forever changed as they became assimilated into Han Chinese society. As the dust settled on this final battle, the great Miao rebellion was all but extinguished. The Han Chinese had emerged victorious, their dominance over the region cemented in blood and steel. The once proud people of the Miao tribes were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered dream, their cultural heritage and way of life forever altered by the brutal realities of war. In the years that followed, many of the captured rebels would be forced to abandon their traditional clothes, language, and customs in favor of Han Chinese garb, speech, and habits. Their children would grow up speaking Mandarin, not Miao dialects. They would learn Confucian morals, not the ancient myths and legends of their forefathers. Yet even as the rebellion's physical remnants disappeared into the misty mountains, its spirit refused to die. The legacy of Wang Fang and Luo Xian lived on in the hearts of their people, inspiring generations of Miao warriors to come. Though the great Miao rebellion had been defeated, its impact would be felt for centuries, shaping the course of Chinese history and forging an unbreakable bond between the Miao people and their sacred mountains. The great Miao rebellion of the 17th century had far-reaching consequences that would forever alter the social, cultural, and political landscape of the region. As the dust settled on the conflict, a trail of devastation was left in its wake, as entire communities were forced to flee their homes, leaving behind the only lives they had ever known. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the once thriving Miao villages lay in ruins, their thatched huts and bamboo structures reduced to ashes. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and charred earth, as if the very land itself had been scorched by the flames of war. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional cry of a lost child, or the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. The displacement of Miao communities was a calamity of epic proportions. Families who had lived for generations in the same valleys and mountains were now forced to eke out a meager existence on the margins of society. They wandered the countryside, searching for scraps of food and shelter, their dignity and cultural heritage left to wither like the once lush crops that had sustained them. As the Miao people struggled to rebuild their lives, the erosion of their culture was an equally devastating consequence. The rebellion had been sparked by a deep-seated desire for autonomy and self-governance, but in its aftermath, the very fabric of Miao society began to fray. Traditional customs and practices were abandoned as families scrambled to survive. The intricate network of kinship ties that had once bound them together began to unravel. In the midst of this chaos, the Chinese government's response was characterized by a callous indifference. The authorities viewed the Miao people not as victims of war, but as rebels who had brought ruin upon themselves. The legacy of mistrust between the two sides would take generations to overcome, a chasm that would only widen with times. As the years passed, the Miao communities were forced to adapt to a new reality. They scattered to distant regions where they struggled to find their footing in an alien landscape. Their once vibrant culture was reduced to whispers and half-forgotten melodies as the younger generations forgot the stories of their ancestors. In the shadows of this turmoil, a new power structure emerged. The Chinese government consolidated its control over the region, exploiting the divisions between the Miao communities and co-opting those who were willing to collaborate. The legacy of mistrust was cemented into place as the Miao people came to view the Chinese authorities with suspicion and hostility. The Great Miao Rebellion may have been a distant memory by the 18th century, but its long-term effects would continue to reverberate throughout the region for generations to come. A cultural heritage that had once thrived in the mountains of southwest China was reduced to mere whispers as the Miao people struggled to reclaim their place in a world forever changed by the fires of war. In the misty mountains of southern China, where the air is crisp and the land is rugged, the Miao people have always been a symbol of resilience and determination. For centuries, they have faced adversity head-on, their cultural identity intact despite the waves of change that have swept through their homeland. And so it was with the Great Miao Rebellion, the 17th century, when the Miao people rose up against the mighty Qing Empire to preserve their way of life. It was a rebellion born from the fires of oppression and the ashes of cultural erasure. As the sun rises over the misty mountains, the sounds of drums and cymbals echo through the valleys, signaling the beginning of another day for the Miao people. But beneath the surface, a sense of unease simmers. The Qing Empire, with its iron grip on the land, has been systematically erasing the Miao culture, forcing them to adopt Han customs and abandon their traditions. The Miao people are a proud and fiercely independent tribe with their own language, dress, and customs. They live in small villages nestled in the mountains where they farm the land and tend to their animals. But as the years pass, the Qing Empire's policies have taken a toll on the Miao way of life. The Miao people are forced to wear Han clothing, abandoning their traditional garb of colorful embroidery and intricate patterns. Their children are taken from them, sent to schools where they are taught Mandarin and Chinese customs. The very fabric of their culture is being ripped apart, thread by thread. As tensions build, a group of brave Miao warriors, led by the fearless Li Shokui, begin to secretly gather in hidden valleys and misty mountains. They are men and women who have lost loved ones, who have seen their way of life destroyed, and who refuse to be silenced. The rebellion begins with whispers and rumors spread from village to village like wildfire. It is a call to arms, a declaration that the Miao people will not go quietly into the night. They will fight for their culture, for their traditions, and for their very existence. As the Qing Empire's armies march towards the mountains, the Miao warriors prepare for battle. Drums beat in the valleys as the Miao people sing songs of defiance and courage. The air is thick with tension as the two forces clash in a spectacular display of bravery and cunning. The rebellion rages on for years, with both sides suffering heavy losses, but despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Miao warriors refuse to give up. They fight with all their might, using guerrilla tactics and clever strategy to whittle down the Qing Empire's forces. As the battles rage on, a sense of national pride grows among the Miao people. They are no longer just fighting for their culture, they are fighting for their very survival. The Miao Rebellion becomes a beacon of hope, inspiring other minority groups across China to stand up against the Qing Empire's tyranny. In the end, the Miao Rebellion is crushed, but not before it has left an indelible mark on Chinese history. The Miao people have fought back against oppression, and in doing so, they have preserved their cultural identity for generations to come. Today, the memory of the Great Miao Rebellion is still celebrated by the Miao people as a symbol of their resilience and determination. It is a testament to the power of the human spirit, which can bend but never break under the weight of adversity. The Great Miao Rebellion of the 17th century, a tale of courage and defiance in the heart of China's southwestern province of Guizhou, a spark ignited among the Miao people, a resilient and proud ethnic minority group. For centuries, they had lived in harmony with the land, their culture woven into the very fabric of the mountains and valleys. But as the Qing dynasty's grip on power tightened, the Miao found themselves caught in a web of oppression, forced to conform to the dominant Han Chinese culture. In the 1620s, the Miao began to organize in secret, fueled by resentment towards the Qing government's policies. The authorities had imposed harsh taxes, confiscated their land, and enforced the wearing of Mandarin-style clothing, an affront to their traditional attire and way of life. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. A charismatic leader emerged, Wang Jingyi, a Miao warrior with unwavering conviction. Wang Jingyi's charisma was matched only by his strategic prowess. He rallied the Miao people, employing guerrilla warfare tactics to harass Qing forces. The Miao rebels targeted supply lines, ambushes, and raids on isolated outposts, striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. Wang's men, clad in their distinctive blue garments, proved relentless opponents, using the treacherous terrain to full effect. As the rebellion gained momentum, it attracted support from other minority groups, including the Tujia and the Dong. The Qing government responded with brutal force, dispatching thousands of soldiers to quell the uprising. However, Wang Jingyi's rebels had a hidden advantage, their intimate knowledge of the landscape. Miao warriors exploited this familiarity by employing clever tactics such as setting fire to dry underbrush to create smoke screens or luring Qing forces into treacherous ravines. The battles became legendary for their ferocity and cunning, with Wang Jingyi's men often outmaneuvering their foes despite being vastly outnumbered. One fateful day in 1629, the Miao rebels launched a daring assault on the Qing-occupied city of Jing'an. Led by Wang Jingyi himself, The rebels stormed the city gates, catching the Qing defenders off guard. Battle raged for hours, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. When the dust settled, the Miao had emerged victorious, their flags waving triumphantly above the captured city. The great Miao rebellion had officially begun its ascent to infamy. As news of the rebellion's success spread, other Miao tribes and neighboring minority groups joined the cause, swelling Wang Jingyi's ranks to an estimated 100,000 fighters. The Qing government, realizing the gravity of the situation, dispatched General Zhang Jing, a seasoned military leader, to crush the uprising. General Zhang's campaign would prove brutal, but ultimately unsuccessful. The Miao rebels adapted their tactics, employing hit-and-run attacks and ambushes to harass the Qing army. Wang Jingyi, ever the master strategist, directed his forces with precision, using the terrain to funnel enemy troops into kill zones or trap them in isolated pockets. As the years passed, the Great Miao Rebellion became a beacon of hope for minority groups across China, inspiring similar uprisings and rebellions against the Qing dynasty's heavy-handed rule. Though ultimately quelled by General Zhang's forces, Wang Jingyi's bravery and cunning would be remembered as an exemplary testament to the indomitable spirit of the Miao people. The Great Miao Rebellion may have ended in defeat, but its legacy lives on, a powerful reminder that even the most seemingly insurmountable forces can be challenged by courage, determination, and a deep connection to the land. The Great Miao Rebellion, a pivotal event in the annals of Chinese history, unfolded like a tempestuous storm cloud on the horizon of the 17th century. It was an uprising that would shake the very foundations of the Ming dynasty, leaving scars that would take centuries to heal. In the misty mountains and lush valleys of southwestern China, the Miao people had long lived in relative harmony with their Han Chinese neighbors. They were a proud and resilient tribe known for their striking red dress and intricate silver jewelry. The Miao had their own distinct culture, language, and customs, which they guarded fiercely against the encroaching influences of the outside world. However, as the Ming dynasty began to wane, the Miao found themselves caught in crossfire of competing powers vying for dominance. The Manchu people from northeastern China, who would eventually supplant the Ming, were expanding their territories and eyeing the strategic regions controlled by the Miao. It was against this backdrop that a charismatic young Miao leader named Wang Fangping emerged. A shrewd strategist and natural warrior, Wang had grown tired of the injustices inflicted upon his people by the Han Chinese authorities. He saw an opportunity to unite the disparate Miao clans under a single banner and to reclaim their ancestral lands from the encroaching Han settlers. Wang's rebellion began with a series of daring raids against Han Chinese settlements, striking fear into the hearts of the local officials and merchants. The Miao warriors, clad in their resplendent red attire, proved formidable opponents, using guerrilla tactics and knowledge of the treacherous mountain terrain to outmaneuver their foes. As news of Wang's rebellion spread, it sparked a wave of sympathy and support among other minority groups in the region, including the Yao and the Zhuang. Together, these groups formed a loose alliance, determined to resist the Han Chinese attempts to assimilate them into the dominant culture. The Han Chinese authorities responded with brutal force, deploying thousands of soldiers to quell the uprising. The campaign was marked by atrocities on both sides, including massacres, torture, and forced deportations. The once peaceful valleys and mountains were transformed into a battleground, scarred by the ravages of war. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Wang's Miao warriors fought valiantly, employing their knowledge of the land to harass and disrupt the Han Chinese armies. The rebels even managed to capture several key strongholds, including the strategic town of Jiangji. However, the tide of the rebellion began to turn when Wang was killed in a skirmish with Han forces. His death sent shockwaves through the Miao ranks, sapping their morale and cohesion. The once united alliance began to fray as different factions turned against one another or surrendered to the Han authorities. In the end, the Great Miao Rebellion was brutally suppressed, with many of its leaders executed or forced into exile. The surviving Miao people were subjected to harsh penalties, including heavy taxes, forced labor, and restrictions on their culture and way of life. The Han Chinese authorities had effectively crushed the rebellion, but at what cost? The legacy of the Great Miao Rebellion would be one of sorrow and resilience, as the Miao people continued to struggle for recognition and autonomy in the face of overwhelming odds. Their story serves as a powerful reminder of the sacrifices made by those who fight for their freedom and the enduring power of cultural identity in the face of oppression. And, I send me